A couple of weeks ago, I talked about one of David's wives, Abigail, the widow of Nabal, and how they met while David was running from Saul. So there are actually 8 wives of David who are listed in the Bible, and then it also mentions that he has other secondary wives once he sets up his capital in Jerusalem as king. But there are 3 of his wives, Abigail and 2 others, Michal and Bathsheba, who get their own stories. We get to hear how they meet. And today I'm going to talk about Michal, who was actually David's very first wife. So when David defeated Goliath, one of the rewards for defeating Goliath was to marry one of King Saul's daughters. And it takes a while before David finally marries not Saul's first daughter as promised, but Saul's second daughter, Michal. And so this goes way back to when David was new in Saul's court, and everybody loved David at that time. Everybody, including Saul's son Jonathan, and also Michal, Saul's daughter. So Saul sees that Michal loves David, so he offers to let David marry Michal, but only on the condition that David pay the bride price or a marriage present of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. So David has to kill 100 Philistines in order to marry Michal, which he is more than happy to do. Meanwhile, Saul's hoping that David will die attempting this. But David makes it, and David marries Michal, and it says that killing the Philistines and being the king's son-in-law appealed to David, but we don't really know how he actually feels about Michal. Well, it repeats that Michal loved David, and it's actually notable that this is according to Robert Alter in The Art of Biblical Narrative. He writes that this is the only instance in all biblical narrative in which we are explicitly told that a woman loves a man. So, and it's not really given the reason for Michal's love. Might speculate that maybe this is a schoolgirl's crush on a celebrity. But in any case, she is quite devoted to him. And when Saul, again, tries to kill David, sends assassins to their home, Michal saves David. And this is the next chapter, chapter 19 of 1 Samuel. Michal says to David, "If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." So Michal let David down through the window. He fled away and escaped. Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed. She put on a net of goat's hair on its head and covered it with the clothes. So she is concealing that David is missing by putting a dummy in the bed to hide that he's missing. And then when Saul finds this out, he's furious at her, and he says, "Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go so that he has escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" So she lies to her father to cover her aid of David's escape. And so from the very beginning, Michal has been stuck between these 2 men, David, her husband, and Saul, her father. And actually, when you read the biblical text, it alternates between identifying Michal as David's wife and as Saul's daughter. So after David runs away with Michal's help, he just leaves Michal behind. And in chapter 25, when David meets Abigail, and we learn that Abigail marries David, there's a note that David married one other woman, Ahinoam, and also that Saul had given Michal to another man as this other man's wife. And this man is called Palti. So Saul no longer sees it as advantageous to have one of his daughters married to David, so he marries her to someone else, And Michal's become a pawn in this Game of Thrones. And actually, she kind of reminds me of Sansa in the Game of Thrones series. So after Saul dies, and there's this bitter civil war, Abner, Saul's commander, is prepared to sue for peace, and David makes it a precondition of negotiations that Michal is returned to him, and he brings up the 100 Philistine foreskins that he paid Saul to marry Michal. And this is basically a political calculation. It is advantageous to David at this time to reconnect himself to Saul's family, to marry Saul's daughter so that he has some relation to the last king and to strengthen his claim to the throne. So the other side sends Michal to David, but her husband, Palti, goes with her weeping. And he is commanded by Abner, the commander, to go home. And what can he do aside from to comply and turn back from his wife that he clearly cares deeply for and go home? And at this point, we don't hear any dialogue between Michal and David. In fact, they have not spoken to each other, or we have not heard the words that David's spoken to her to this point. And so we don't know when they're reunited what Michal's feelings about all this are, what her feelings for Palti were, and what her feelings about returning to David are. And we don't really know, other than being politically convenient, how David feels about Michal. And then, so it's not until chapter 6 of 2 Samuel that we finally get to see their relationship. So in chapter 6, that was this last Sunday's first reading, and it's David carrying the ark into Jerusalem. So he's set up his capital in Jerusalem, and he's bringing the holiest item into Jerusalem, and he's dancing wildly before it. And it says that David danced before the Lord with all his might, and that David was girded with a linen ephod. So basically, David was dancing really wildly in a short skirt. And it says, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. But we don't hear right away why she despises him. But that window reminds me of the window that she helped David escape through all those years earlier. So they bring in the ark, and David blesses it and blesses the people in the name of the Lord. He is kind of acting as high priest, which is something that Michal's father, Saul, got in trouble for when he was king. So after David's done with the public stuff, David returns to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, she's Saul's daughter here, not David's wife, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. And David's reply is, it was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I have danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, and by them I shall be held in honor. So there's this public exchange outside of the house where Michal verbally objects to David's lack of royal dignity. But what she says maybe hints at a little sexual jealousy, that maybe she is, now at this point, David has several more wives, and perhaps she has gone from being David's first wife to a neglected co-wife who's merely politically convenient. And David is now king, and so he gets the last word with Michal in this exchange. And Michal's story ends in the next verse. It says, "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." And the reason for that is not given, whether it's divine, as is often the case in the Bible, or domestic, that she and David just didn't have contact again. Or it could be a coincidence, but David no longer needs an heir through Michal from Saul's line, so the houses of Saul and David never are united. And actually some rabbinic stories do say that Michal did in fact finally have a child, looking closely at the wording of that verse, but she died in childbirth, so she had no child to the day of her death. So this young girl who was so in love with Israel's hero becomes the jealous and sad co-wife among many others, and dies childless. And so in a couple weeks we'll hear about the third wife that David meets, and it's an unconventional meeting again, Bathsheba.